good afternoon to all of you who took the time to stop by and to join us on today. First of all, let me just say how grateful I am to first be here at the University of Memphis, but also to be scholar in residence at the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change. Ben Hooks was a towering figure here locally as well as nationally. Like myself, he was a pastor, an activist, and to be associated with the name Benjamin L. Hooks is truly an honor for me. My pastor, Melvin Charles Smith, the Reverend Melvin Charles Smith, were good friends with Benjamin Hooks, and I have heard many stories about Ben Hooks. And again, just to be associated with the name and with this wonderful institution and with the great folk who work to make all of this possible, our Facebook Live events, our other book talks, and the other things, Hamey, and all of the other things that we do. I am truly, truly grateful for being associated again with this institute, and again with the name, the Reverend Dr. Benjamin L. Hooks. Today, I want to, if I give title rather to my talk today, I just simply want to call it The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, and also give an overview of the book itself. And then, of course, open up for questions and comments afterwards. In 1902, author and lecturer D.W. Culp published 20th Century Negro Literature, or an encyclopedia of thought on the vital topics relating to the American Negro. Culp collected essays from 100 African Americans addressing different topics pertinent to African Americans at the turn of the 20th century. These women and men were leading Black intellectuals of their day. The book was noteworthy because, according to Culp, this was the only book that had brought such a, quote, an array of Negro talent, writing on the multiplicity of subjects contained therein. Also, the book also offered a corrective in the interpretation and presentation of African Americans since emancipation. Many authors used their essays as refutations of the prevailing thought and ideology of African Americans during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among the intellectuals Culp invited to submit an essay was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. Culp asked him and 3 other prominent African Americans to address the question, will it be possible for the Negro to attain in this country unto the American type of civilization? The 3 other invited essayists took on a more conservative or moderate tone in answering the question. However, Bishop Turner, senior bishop of the AME Church, interrogated the merits of the question. For Turner, the question presumed America was a civilized nation at all. Moreover, if the presumption was valid, the question also assumed that African Americans had not yet attained American civilization. Therefore, in addressing the question, Turner first defined civilization. For him, civilization contemplates that fraternity, civil and political equity, and equality between man and man that makes his rights, privileges, and immunities inviolable and sacred in the eyes and hearts of his fellows, whatever may be his nationality, language, color, hair texture, or anything else that may make an external variation. He continued by noting, quote, civility comprehends harmony, system, method, complacency, urbanity, refinement, politeness, courtesy, justice, culture, general enlightenment, and protection of life and person to any man, regardless of the color or nationality. It is enough for a civilized community, he continues, to know that you are a human being, to pledge surety to physical and political safety to you. And this has been the sequence in all ages among civilized people. But such is not the condition of things that they apply to this country. I mean, the United States. While acknowledging that the United States had almost every form of government necessary to regulate the affairs of a civilized country, he lamented that, quote, we are often confronted through the public press with reports of the most barbarous and cruel outrages that can be perpetrated upon human beings known in the history of the world. Further, Turner wrote that no savage nation can exceed the atrocities which are often hurled through the country and accepted by many as an incidental consequence. Men, he continued, are hung and shot and burned by bands of marauders who are almost invariably represented as the most influential and respectable citizens in the community, while the evidences of guilt of what is charged against the victims who are so inhumanely outraged are never established by proof in any court. And all we can learn about the guilt and the horrible deeds charged upon the murderers' victims come from the mouth of the bloody-handed wretches who perpetrate the murders, yet they are not known according to published accounts. For Turner, judges surrounded with court officers are powerless before these bloody mobs, and sheriffs are as helpless as newborn babes. While admitting that some of the victims of lynching may have been guilty of some blood-curdling crime, Turner placed the presumed guilt of the victims within the context of civilization. Here's what he wrote. Civilization presupposes legal adjudication and the intervention of that judicial authority which civilized legislation produces. And when properly administered, the accused is innocent until he gets a fair trial. No verdict of guilt from a drunken, lawless mob should be accepted by a civilized country. And when they do it, when they do accept it, rather, they become a barbarous people, and a barbarous people make a barbarous nation. Civilization knows no marauders, mobs, or lynchers, and if anyone adjudged guilty by a drunken band of freebooters is not guilty in the eyes of civilized people. For the ruthless and violent perpetrators of lawless deeds, especially when they are incarnate, are murderers to all intents and purposes, and popular approval does not diminish the magnitude of the crime. Millions would say, well done, but God, reason, and civilization stamp them as culprits. Now, Turner confessed that the United States had the, quote, highest form of civilized institutions of any country, had enough Bibles to build a pyramid that would almost reach to heaven. However, when the United States had, according to Turner, all of the forms and paraphernalia of civilization, he argued that no one can say, who has any respect for truth, that the United States is a civilized nation, especially if we take the daily papers and inspect them for a few moments and see the deeds of horror that the ruling powers of the nation say, well done, while admitting that many would not and have not participated in these violent and gory outrages on people of African descent. He reminded his audience that physically not participating, quote, is no virtue that calls for admiration. For Turner, silence was betrayal. Quote, as long as they keep silent and fail to lift up their voices in protestation and declaim against it, their very silence is a worldwide acquiescence. It is practically saying, well done. There are millions of people in this country who could not stand to kill a brute, such as their nervous sensitiveness. And I have heard of persons who would not kill a snake or a bug, but they are guilty of everything the drunken mobs do, as long as they hold their silence. Men may be ever so free from the perpetration of bloody deeds personally, but their failure to object to any outrageous crime makes them complicit. Now, near the close of the essay, Turner reminded his audience of the robbery on public highways that allows public transportation companies to place African Americans in Jim Crow cars, charge them the same amount as those in rolling palaces with every comfort that is possible for a person to enjoy. This is simple robbery on the highways, he argued. And the 9 United States judges have approved of this robbery and said, well done by their verdict. Then Turner turned back to the question of the essay. Such being the barbarous condition of the United States, he surmised, and the low order of civilization which controls its institutions, where right and justice should sit enthroned, I see nothing for the Negro to attain until in this country. Further, he wrote that he did not see anything for African Americans to aspire after. He could return to Africa, he lamented, especially to Liberia, where Negro government is already in existence, and learn the elements of civilization. In fact, for human life is sacred and no man is deprived of it or any other thing that involves his manhood without due process of law. So my decision is that there is nothing in the United States for the Negro to learn or try to attain to. Now, Turner's treatment of the question, his skepticism of America being a civilized nation, his description of the abuses faced by African Americans, his use of language that was meant to shock and provoke, and his overall tone of dismissive nature toward the goodness of America provide an example of a writer adopting a prophetic persona and using prophetic rhetoric. Once primarily the purview of religious studies scholars, since the publication of James Darcy's seminal text, The Prophetic Tradition and Radical Rhetoric in America, literary and rhetorical critics have found prophecy and the prophetic tradition worthy of study. However, as Anthony J. Stone and I argue, quote, much of the study of prophetic rhetoric negates the contributions of African-American scholars and those who study African-American prophetic rhetoric. It is this lack of attention by scholars, we contend, that leads many to understand the prophetic rhetoric only from a white European framework that understands the people as the new Israel, grounded in the ideals of freedom, individualism, and called people of God. Further, we surmise that it is this oversight that impedes scholars from seeing the African-American version of prophetic rhetoric that is profoundly different. Moreover, despite Christian Lynn Macho's contention that we do not know how to uncover prophetic rhetoric or how to test for prophetic rhetoric, I have defined the genre as discourse grounded in the sacred, rooted in a community experience that offers a critique of existing communities and traditions by charging and challenging society to live up to the ideals espoused, by offering celebration and hope for a brighter future. It is a rhetoric characterized by its steadfast refusal to adapt itself to the perspectives of its audience, and a rhetoric that dedicates itself to the rights of individuals. Located on the margins of society, it intends to lift the people to an ethical conception of what the people deem as sacred by adopting at times a controversial style of speaking. I further maintain, traditionally, critics studying prophetic rhetoric tend to situate the discourse within two primary traditions. The first one is apocalyptic prophecy. The second one is the more popular Jeremiad. The term Jeremiad, meaning a lamentation or doleful complaint, derives from the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, who warned of Israel's fall and the destruction of Jerusalem. The fall came because the people's failure to keep the Mosaic covenant. However, even though Jeremiah denounced Israel's wickedness and prophesied destruction in the short term, he always looked for a day when the nation will repent and be restored. The Jeremiad became part of the American rhetorical tradition around the 17th century among the New England Puritans as a way to express their self-identity as a chosen people, believing that they had a divine plan to flee from corrupt European religious and social establishment. The Puritans, as many will later call them, felt the need to establish a, quote, holy society in the wilderness of America. And once settled in America, they started to reshape the Jeremiad. Drawing from the biblical story in the Exodus, of the Exodus, the Puritans saw themselves as, quote, New Israel, leaving the bondage of Europe to come to the New World they believed to be the promised land. They felt sure of themselves because in being the new Israel, the Puritans believed themselves to be the chosen ones, God called and ordained to be the instrument of God's will. With those chosen people leading the way, America was to become the, quote, city on the hill whose light shone for all to see. When the Puritans fell short of their call and ideal, typically the ministers in the community called the people to task. According to Howard Pickney, as Puritan society fell short of its goal of civic perfection, the Jeremiad became a ubiquitous ritual of self-reproach and exhortation. Puritan ministers deplored a long list of perceived social failings, denouncing the people for their sins and social misconduct, and warned of worse tribulations and divine punishments to come if they did not strictly observe once more to the terms of their covenant with God. And the terms of the promise spelled out was God called us to be a peculiar and special people. We are the new Israel, and America is the new promised land. And we must remember this and act accordingly. And when we forget this, God's judgment will come upon us. Not only did the Jeremiad come with self-reproach and exhortation, but when things went wrong, it also had what Berkovich called this unshakable optimism. In short, Puritans believed that when turmoil and trouble came upon them, it was indeed God's punishment for sin, but that punishment was a corrective, not for destruction. In other words, God maybe was angry with them, but God had not replaced them with anyone else. As Berkovich noted, here as nowhere else, God's vengeance was a sign of love, a father's rod used to improve the errant child. In short, their punishments confirmed the promise. Now, in his 1902 essay, Turner's use of prophetic rhetoric, however, was not an example of those aforementioned types. He grounded his use of prophetic rhetoric within the African-American prophetic tradition. Unlike the prophetic rhetoric of the Jeremiad, the African-American prophetic tradition has its origins not in freedom, but in slavery. Birthed from slavery and shaped in Jim and Jane Crow America, the African-American version of the prophetic tradition has been the primary vehicle that has comforted and given voice to many African-Americans. Through struggle and sacrifice, this tradition has expressed Black people's call for unity and cooperation, as well as the community's anger and frustration. It has been both hopeful and pessimistic. It has celebrated the beauty and myth of American exceptionalism and its special place in the world, while at the same time damning it to hell for not living up to the ideals America espouses. It's a tradition that celebrates both the creator or the divine's hand in history, offering hallelujahs for the deliverance of slavery in Jim and Jane Crow, while at the same time asking, where in the hell is God during the tough and trying times? It is a tradition that develops a theological outlook quite different at times from orthodoxy, one that finds God very close, but also very far away. This tradition, moreover, does not exclusively reside in either the apocalyptic or the Jeremiad forms of prophetic discourse. Though African Americans have used both types of prophetic speech, the contextual restraints and the rhetorical exigencies have not always allowed for an apocalyptic or a Jeremiad appeal. For instance, many Americans' Jeremiad simply at times pose a significant problem. Inherent in the Jeremiad is that its proponents never question the foundational premise of its belief, or in prophetic terms, it never questions the sacred. People primarily using the Jeremiah never at once questioned the faith in America's promise and destiny. They never questioned their belief that they were the new Israel or the chosen people, or that America was indeed the promised land. Therefore, whenever calamity happened, the Puritans may have believed it was because they have sinned or gotten away from the covenant, but belief in the covenant never faltered. When calamity came, many Puritans interpreted the disaster or judgment as God showing God's love, as loving parents would do from time to time. Once the people start to live up to what God told them to hold as sacred, then the calamity would cease and God would heal the land. However, for many African Americans, they just did not have confidence or think the covenant will work for them. Therefore, if African Americans adopted a prophetic persona to appeal to their audiences, they had to find other traditions or draw from other traditions. Turner's prophetic persona shifted over time. For instance, during the Civil War, Turner, like many African Americans during this time, believed that the Civil War served two purposes. First, to free the enslaved, and second, as divine retribution for the sin of slavery. The war for Turner was an apocalyptic moment that shifted policy in America. And after the war, he argued that all Americans should celebrate the emancipation. And after emancipation, Turner adopted what I call a covenantal or a universal prophetic persona. In other words, Turner saw himself as prophet to all the people and as a conduit that could bring people together under a common cause. Turner saw this because for him, emancipation was a new day. What apocalyptic rhetoric brings in or usher in a new day or a new era for Blacks and whites to work together, to help America to become the place where anyone could enjoy freedom and justice. With much of his oratory, Turner's hope arose from his belief in America's divine mission. This mission, suppressed during the days of slavery, found a new life after emancipation, and Turner argued that America could live up to the promise of equality. It's within this divine mission that both Blacks and whites could work together, and Turner challenged both parties to do so. Armed with this belief, Turner moved to Georgia, began working at building the AME Church, and eventually involving himself in the politics of Reconstruction. However, after getting elected to the state legislature, white representatives shook Turner's belief in the American covenant at its foundation by voting to expel the African-American representatives because white representatives felt that Black ones were inferior. Soon after this, Turner's prophetic persona shifted from a covenantal prophet to a representative prophet who represented the interests of African Americans. Turner would no longer ground his rhetoric in the sacredness and divine mission of America, but rather in the sacredness and sacred character of God. Throughout the rest of his career, Turner would expand his conception and interpretation of God to demonstrate that God worked in the lives of the people Turner claimed to represent. The other noticeable change in Turner's prophetic rhetoric during this period was his conception of encouragement and hope. After his expulsion from the Georgia House of Representatives, Turner no longer saw the day where Blacks and whites could work together in unity, but now he promoted a vision where God would serve as judge of the injustices that happened to African Americans at the hands of unjust white people. As time went on, however, Turner's prophetic persona would shift yet again. While he still operated as a representative prophet on behalf of African Americans, Turner adopted a pragmatic prophetic persona as he turned his attention to a plan of action rather than calling his audience to celebrate or aim for some covenant. Frustrated by society's dealings with African Americans and annoyed by African Americans' responses to unjust treatment, Turner began to promote immigration as an answer to the problems facing African Americans. For Turner, America was in an apostate condition that only God could cure. Therefore, in the meantime, African Americans should do all in their power to, quote, seek other quarters. When he saw that African Americans were not willing or could not afford to participate in immigration to Africa, Turner adopted a pessimistic prophetic persona. At this time of his life, Turner had no confidence in American institutions or that American people would live up to the promises in their sacred documents. Turner's position limited his rhetorical options, but by adopting a prophetic, pessimistic voice, Turner found space in his oratory, or for his oratory, which reflected itself within the lament tradition of prophecy. As Turner's cynicism grew, he also became bitter and more forceful in his attacks against society and other African Americans who found hope in anti-immigration policies such as integration and accommodation. However, it was within the lament tradition that Turner could still find relevance as an orator by offering critiques not only of society, but also of Black leadership. By this time, Turner's representative persona shifted from African Americans in general to primarily Southern Blacks, the ones who face most of the oppression and the ones more open to immigration. Turner's constant call for immigration would have sounded very hopeful to many of the people of the South who had nothing to lose, but also just as hopeful were the continuous reminders of injustice that affected Southern Blacks, because through Turner's oratory, Southern Blacks felt heard as well. And I know in the Q&A, I'll get a chance to talk more about the prophetic pessimism of Turner. So I want to come to a conclusion by talking about what I argue in No Future. I argue that Turner's primary focus for the last 20 years of his life was chronicling then the sufferings of poor African Americans, whom many believe others had simply forgotten. Turner rejected confidential or gerrymandered rhetoric because he did not believe African Americans would ever be part of a covenant. While he believed that God would eventually judge America for its indifference toward Blacks, Turner rejected apocalyptic rhetoric because he felt the judgment was not coming soon or soon enough. Therefore, it was in the lament tradition of prophecy that Turner found a space to voice his pessimistic prophecy. At this time of his life, Turner had no confidence in American institutions or that the American people would live up to the promises outlined in their sacred documents. While he argued that immigration was the only way for African Americans to retain their personhood status, he also would come to believe that African Americans would never immigrate to Africa. He argued that many African Americans were so oppressed, so stripped of agency, surrounded by continued negative assessments of their personhood, that belief in immigration was not possible. Turner's position limited his rhetorical options, but by adopting a prophetic, pessimistic voice, he bore witness to the atrocities African Americans faced. Turner thus found space for his oratory. I'll argue in No Future that Turner becomes a wailing and moaning prophet whose primary function was to speak out on the behalf of others and to chronicle their pain and their suffering. Turner's pessimism and rhetorical laments caused him to lose much of his support. After the death of Frederick Douglass in 1895, many thought Turner was poised to take Douglass's leadership mantle. However, Turner's prophetic call kept that from happening. His strong positions against the Supreme Court, his ever-changing and at times radical theology, his anti-war position, his public support for Democratic nominee William Jennings Bryan, his consistent push for immigration, and his damning of America was just too much. Add to this his invectives aimed at African-American leaders and his constant infighting with other bishops and leaders of his church, and one begins to understand why many had disdain and, yes, utter contempt sometimes for Turner. However, as I argue in the book, Turner's laments and prophetic pessimism are all the more relevant to study because they differ from much of the African-American rhetoric during this period. Much of this rhetoric centered on a bright future and a glorious hope for African Americans, grounded in what historian Ibram Kendi calls uplift suasion. Turner, on the other hand, not only highlighted the pain and suffering of African Americans, but he made it the focus of his rhetoric. This focus fit within the lament tradition of prophecy, a tradition that could house Turner bitterness and anger, both with the system that would not allow Blacks to take part and with what he argued to be the apathetic nature of many Black leaders. At the same time, it gave Turner a voice as a pessimistic prophet who declared there is no personhood future in the United States for the Negro. In addition, Turner's prophetic pessimism allowed him to become more philosophical, that led him to offer a deep and penetrating analysis of the current situations facing many African Americans. For example, while many scholars recognize Du Bois as the father of Black identity studies because of his off-site double consciousness phrase, Turner first saw how a flawed construction of identity would be detrimental to African Americans. Grounded in his prophetic pessimism, Turner saw what social scientists and cultural critics will acknowledge in the 20th century, that segregation had an injurious effect upon African Americans. No future in this country. The prophetic pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner was a joy for me to write, and I hope that joy comes across as you read the book. Thank you. And now I will take some questions.
I think I can speak for all of us watching when I say I'm pretty impressed with the amount of material you were able to cover in that time. So thank you for sharing your gift and your book with us. Actually, so I had a question I wanted to ask, and it ties in pretty well with the first question that came through the chat. So you said that you did mention how your work is in contrast to James Darcy, another seminal academic work on prophecy, in particular because the discipline of rhetoric has been mostly concerned with white radical figures. But one thing I'd like to hear about is how your understanding of prophecy, of the prophet, prophetic persona, is distinct from what we might call more popular notions of the prophet or prophecy, which I think is pretty relevant to our contemporary political situation. And so, one, I would like for you to sort of help us delineate that, and then two, maybe help us understand how we can gain a little more of this prophetic edge.
Great question. And one of the questions that I had to work with when I was doing the dissertation, for everybody who don't know, I've been studying and been working with Turner since 2005. So I am beginning my 16th year studying him, and just this amazing figure. And one of the things that I had to say early on is that the prophecy or prophetic rhetoric that I'm talking about, it's not this foretelling, foretelling, where predictions, you hear, especially in the church, a prophet would speak and say that, I foresee in such and such time that you will be blessed and you will be highly favored and God gonna send you a partner and, all of that. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about foretelling, foretelling, in which means this whole notion of speaking truth to power. The Greeks call it the parrhesia, that this speaking, if you will, to power, this woe unto you, and which we do have in the Old Testament prophets of the 8th century, and within the Christian understanding, if you will, of Jesus as prophet and as the prophet of Galilee, as I like to say. So that's what I am talking about when I talk about this. And so now I have to take that, got that unpacked, and now I have to talk about what am I talking about when I speak of prophetic rhetoric in the public arena. Are people, talking about, what are people talking about, rather, in the public arena? And so I began to start studying the scholarship surrounding radical rhetoric and prophetic rhetoric, and much of it had been centered on a dramatic understanding of prophetic discourse, which comes from this whole concept that I talked about in the talk, America being a new Israel. America's going to be the light on shining light on the hill, and that white immigrants, let's just call it, white immigrants were the new Israel and the people of God. And Black folk, even doing all of this, were doing prophetic discourse and prophetic rhetoric, but they were not using a Jeremiah. They were not calling people back to the covenant, because a lot of Black folk saw the covenant as the problem. The covenant is broken. The covenant needs fixing. So what kind of prophetic personas can Black people adopt? And so that's when I came up with these 4 different types of prophetic discourses. And what I talk about in No Future is the prophetic pessimism. A person can adopt a prophetic pessimistic persona in order to get their messages across. So my contribution to the field is a African-American understanding of prophetic discourse, and that all prophetic discourse is not grounded within an apocalyptic or a Jeremitic form of discourse. I hope I make sense.
No, yeah. So the second part of that then is, how do we sort of regain or relearn this prophetic edge? And would you say that part of it is that we need to lose hope in the covenant?
Wow. Oh man. Well, for the pessimist, yes, and for even the pragmatic prophet, sometimes. I think what you're getting at, Brother Tom, is also when we hear the edge of the Black prophetic tradition, especially within the prophetic pessimism, that it's uncomfortable. And people bristle against it and push back. But it is part of the tradition. And it is part of the tradition because the prophet discerns at that particular time that the only way that I can find voice to speak about the particular issue that is not changing. And here's the kicker, probably will not change. Matter of fact, after I get through talking, people might double down on the issue because they're going to get mad at me. You still get up and you still speak, because the other part I did not get a chance to talk about in prophetic pessimism is this whole notion of bearing witness, that there is a witness, that, this comes from the Old Testament prophets as well, that one cannot say one have not heard or one did not know, because there's always a remnant, and it's usually a small remnant, that's speaking truth to power, bearing witness to the atrocity that's happening in real time. And the sad part about it is that we only recognize it 10, 15, 20, 30 years later sometimes.
It's really interesting to hear you process that, because in your definition of prophecy, you say that the prophet is challenging society to live up to its ideals while offering a celebration and hope. But then when we talk about the pessimistic prophet, they're still issuing that really aggressive challenge, but it doesn't seem as hopeful.
Right.
But you say that the hope is rooted in just the mere witness of the suffering of Black Americans. Can you unpack how the witness is hopeful?
The witness is hopeful. Let me just give 2 reasons, I think. The witness is hopeful. First, when other people who are going through what it is that you are proclaiming against, when you are standing against, other people are listening to that and saying to themselves, oh my God, thank you. I know now that I'm not the only one feel like this. And that is a hopeful reminder that others are with you. Sometimes when you're going through something, or when the oppression is so much that the weight of the world is on your shoulders, you think it's like on my shoulders individually. But somebody comes up from the community, someone heard your cries, and then speaks it. So that's one. But the other way is the one that I really talk about in the book, and I think Turner does I give credit to Turner for doing this. It is also getting people to understand where they are, so you will not have what I have termed, which I need to do some more unpacking, toxic optimism. Toxic optimism kills a lot of folk. And what I mean by that is you can have your hopes up so high that things are going, that if I just show up, for instance, I use this example, that if I just show up to a protest with a sign, that somehow somebody's going to see my sign, as if nobody has done this before. Somebody's going to see my sign. Or better yet, if I can just get an audience with the person in charge, the whole, I need to talk to your manager. If I can just get that person in charge to hear my cogent argument that everything is going to be fine. And when it doesn't happen that way, it can crush folk. It can crush folk in real time. It can crush folk over time. And what prophetic pessimism does is I think, you're on an even keel. Yes, you celebrate all victories and you celebrate hard, but you also know that this work probably will not get rectified while you're doing it, or maybe even in your lifetime. And you got to come to grips with that. And I think Turner did, and that's what gets you up. That's what stops you from being nihilistic and giving up. It gets you up to go out and to do, because you are now responding to call instead of duty only. You're responding to call. And this is my call. This is my witness. This is where I carry the baton. And then when my call is over, I will be able to pass the baton to someone else. I think in that way, it helps everyone continue to do the work that you feel called to do. Not saying that, hey, tomorrow is going to change, but to be part of that long witness that have just passed the baton, grabbed the baton and passed and made life just a little bit better for the next group of people coming along.
You say in The Forgotten Prophet, that your earlier book, that Bishop Turner goes through really a process before he gets to his pessimistic phase. In particular, even in your lecture today, you talked about how Turner had a phase where he didn't think emigration was necessary because he thought maybe there was a future here. What was the catalyst for his shift toward pessimistic?
I mean, if I can just sum it up, I would just say the broken promises of Reconstruction. Historians have talked about this and wrote about this. Rhetoric scholars are getting to this because we haven't done as much work in the Reconstruction period as we should have. And that's just a shout out for folk. We need to study the Reconstruction period, especially now more than ever. But Reconstruction was this opportunity for America to have a multiracial democracy. For the first time, it was an opportunity. And Turner bought into that opportunity. He worked for it. He saw it. He could almost taste it. He wrote matter of fact, he was willing to meet any former Confederate halfway. So, for instance, when he's with the State Constitutional Convention in 1867, he supported not bringing Confederates up for trial, not bringing them up for trial for treason, not taking their property, he said, look, this is a new day. Let bygones be bygones. And you're hearing this type of rhetoric even today. So he's thinking like that. So when those broken promises happen and lynching goes unabated, convict lease system gets implemented, voting rights, and then the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court crushed Turner because that was the last arbiter of hope that at least with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed, Civil Rights Bill in 1875 passed. Turner is like, this is it. We good now. But the reinterpretation of those amendments and how, as we know in history, how the South really did with voting and how the South and many states now are doing with voting, Turner begins to just get frustrated. And it was the context that led him to become this pessimistic prophet that, his career lasted over 60 plus years. He saw it all from antebellum, Civil War, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, turn of the century. And it's for him, just imagine if you were Turner, that you did all of this work, and by the end of your life, and things, at least in his estimation, were not getting better, it was getting worse.
Dr. Johnson, just going to ask you one more question here. You spoke previously of creating something where you can pass the baton when you're gone.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that Turner has done by leaving us just all these writings has allowed him really to, in some ways, pass the baton to people after him, such as yourself. And I wonder, in you passing the baton also to us, how would you like to see that prophetic fire alive in the people listening today? Or maybe more specifically, if I could ask it a different way, what would Bishop Henry McNeil Turner say to us today as we continue our fight for reparative justice and equal rights?
He would say, just keep on fighting, because the forces that are against you are always marshaling together, always going to offer a resistance. I mean, and we can just go through history and we can see any progressive inching, any progressive movement has always been met with a backlash of resistance, a conservative backlash of resistance, people who want to keep the status quo. And Turner would be the one to tell us not to fall for that like he did. And in his writings, he did admit that one of the gravest mistakes that he ever made, especially when he was in the House and when he was on a state constitutional convention committee, was not holding accountable the folk who insurrected against the country. Not holding accountable the people who meant you personal harm. So I think Turner would warn us about that. And then, of course, he will also warn us not to get caught up in, again, what I call toxic optimism. Optimism is good. It helps and it fires you up. But when it becomes toxic, it can just bury you. And once that happens, it's hard to get back up.